If a nuclear war had broken out during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it would have started exactly here. Without exaggeration, this day became one of the most dangerous for humanity in the entire history of the Cold War. So, what made this situation so dangerous? The ship-dropping practice depth charges is American. These bombs, I repeat, are practice rounds. There is no objective to sink the submarine. They merely want to force it to surface. At this time, active negotiations are underway between the leaders of the US and the Soviet Union regarding the resolution of the current crisis, and they are proceeding extremely successfully. A compromise between the superpowers has almost been found. And the absolute horror of the situation is that deep underwater, the Soviet submarine has no communication. The crew does not know about the progress in negotiations between the countries. They do not even know whether the nuclear war has started or not. But what is most terrifying, they do not know that the depth charges being dropped on them are practice rounds. The submarine was sent to break through the blockade of Cuba, but it was detected, and now bombs are raining down on it. It is entirely possible that a war had started while they had no communication. There simply was no way to inform the crew about it, which means they want to destroy the submarine, and therefore it is necessary to defend themselves. In torpedo tube number 1, there was a torpedo with a nuclear warhead yielding about 20 kilotons, which is comparable to the yield of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 20 kilotons is serious power, without a doubt, but its danger pales in comparison to what would have started a few minutes after its launch. But let's pause for a moment. To understand what happens next, we first need to understand the context of what is going on. The two superpowers approached the hottest phase of the Cold War gradually. The degree of tension was constantly rising. The Korean War, where the Soviet Union and the US did not fight directly, but did so through proxies. The creation of the Warsaw Pact Organization, a direct rival to NATO. The downing of the American U-2 spy plane. The US denied it was a spy flight, but the pilot survived and revealed his actual mission. As a result, an international scandal. The Berlin Crisis. The city was literally divided into two parts by a wall. Perhaps this became the most striking example of the irreconcilability of the two systems. Tanks faced each other head-on. Just one shot and the consequences would have been catastrophic. October 30th, 1961. The Soviet Union detonates the most powerful thermonuclear bomb in history. The explosion was approximately 3,500 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In the city of Izmir, Turkey, ballistic missiles appear with a thermonuclear warhead yield of 1.4 megatons. Each missile was 100 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But their power wasn't the main problem. The flight time to Moscow was only 10 minutes, which left almost no time for a retaliatory strike. Such a situation was unacceptable for the Soviet Union. And so, we gradually moved to Cuba, where the Soviet Union got an opportunity to give an asymmetrical response. Casino. Casino. And here is one more. Before the revolution, Cuba was literally a resort for wealthy Americans. An island with all the amenities right next to Florida, an ideal vacation destination. Expensive hotels, luxurious restaurants. Poverty and unemployment on the other side of life. The situation developed rapidly. The victory of the revolution led by Castro. Land, banks, factories, and other enterprises belonging to U.S. corporations are expropriated. The U.S. declares a strict trade embargo. And here the focus shifts to the second superpower. Now Cuba is an ally of the Soviet Union, which buys its sugar and supplies oil. Naturally, the U.S. could not leave the situation without their intervention. The CIA organizes an invasion of the island by armed Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, also known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a failure. Operation codenamed Mongoose, a large-scale sabotage plan against Castro's government. The main goal: destroy Cuba's economy, provoke an internal rebellion, and overthrow Fidel Castro. Obviously, Cuba could not resist such a giant as the US for long. Castro declared the revolution socialist and asked the Soviet Union for military protection. Defending Cuba with conventional weapons did not seem possible, so the Soviet leadership made a secret proposal to deploy nuclear weapons on the island. Cuba agreed. At this stage, the interests of Cuba, led by Castro, and the Soviet Union aligned. Cuba received protection from a US invasion. And what about the Soviet Union? You see, the forces at that time were not equal. In the early 1960s, no nuclear parity existed yet. The US held a significant advantage in the number of nuclear warheads and their delivery systems capable of securely reaching enemy territory. The situation for the Soviet Union was worsened by the fact that the US had bases near its borders where nuclear weapons were also deployed: Great Britain, Italy, and now Turkey. Of course, the Soviet Union was not defenseless, but the balance of power was clearly on the side of the US. And thanks to Cuba, the Soviet Union got an opportunity to give a direct response to this threat and even the odds. And in July 1962, the delivery of Soviet weaponry begins in the strictest secrecy. When I say in the strictest secrecy, I am not exaggerating. The difficulty lay in the fact that the required weaponry could only be delivered on cargo ships, which are easily visible from the air. If a US military aircraft spotted weapons on any of the vessels, the Soviet Union's plan would be exposed, Cuba would be blockaded, and the ships with weapons would never reach it. A blockade of Cuba would still be imposed, but it would be imposed too late. For this reason, no one was supposed to know what was actually being transported on these ships from the moment of loading to the destination. And to ensure this, serious measures were taken. Equipment, as well as missiles, were placed inside the ship. Whatever remained on deck was carefully disguised. Missiles can be hidden, but dozens of ships themselves cannot, so the cover story became the transportation of agricultural equipment. The personnel were forbidden to go on deck during the daytime in order not to be detected by US planes. The crew learned the destination port only when they were already in the Atlantic Ocean, and after a journey of 15 to 20 days, the ship would arrive at its destination. But even after that, everything was done in the strictest secrecy. The military personnel were dressed in civilian clothes, and the military equipment was unloaded only at night. This operation can truly be called outstanding. In secret, right under the nose of the US, 162 nuclear warheads in various configurations were delivered to Cuba. But what posed the main threat were the missiles. It was planned to deploy R-12 ballistic missiles in Cuba with a range of 2,000 kilometers and a thermonuclear warhead yielding 1 megaton, which is approximately 70 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was also planned to deploy the more modern R-14 ballistic missile with a range of 4,500 kilometers. In this scenario, almost the entire territory of the US was within the strike range of these ballistic missiles with a flight time of about 10 minutes. The Soviet Union was indeed able to give an equal response. Now the two superpowers were at parity, if not in the number of warheads, but in the level of threat. It was impossible to keep the missile bases a secret forever, and on October 14th, a U-2 reconnaissance plane photographed the launch pads of R-12 medium-range missiles. For the US leadership, this was an alarming surprise. Decisive action had to be taken. From this moment on, the tension between the countries would only increase. Kennedy was presented with three options: a targeted bombing of the missile bases to destroy them, a full-scale invasion of Cuba and its complete occupation. But this would not remain without retaliatory measures. Most likely, the Soviet Union would strike back in West Berlin, which made this option less than ideal, and a naval blockade. That was the option the US ultimately settled on. On October 24th, a quarantine of Cuba is imposed. 238 ships, 8 aircraft carriers, and 13 submarines took part in this blockade. The US attempts to inspect all vessels heading to Cuba, including Soviet ships. At the same time, the captains of the Soviet ships were given an order not to comply with these inspection demands. Reports came from them about constant flyovers over the ships by US helicopters, as well as low-level passes by planes. From October 24th to 26th, there were many such reports, but not a single ship ever stopped for inspection. Dangerous situations between the ships of the two countries arose constantly and could have led to a serious and uncontrollable escalation of the conflict. The next day became the peak of tension during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Since October 18th, the countries had been actively participating in negotiations and looking for a compromise. This was done at various levels and through different communication channels. And there were results. On October 27th, the countries practically agreed on resolving the conflict. But something happened that could nullify all the successes of the negotiations. Once again, a U-2 reconnaissance plane, which was once again conducting a reconnaissance flight, once again it was shot down by an S-75 system, this time over the territory of Cuba. The pilot died. Many Americans demanded immediate retaliation, The military leadership demanded the same. Kennedy rejected this proposal. But let's return to the submarines from the beginning of our story, because exactly on this day, the day the U-2 was shot down, on the day of the highest tension between the countries, the U.S. was dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine with a nuclear torpedo on board. Back on October 1st, out of the Soviet Union, as part of the top-secret Operation Kama, 4 submarines departed. On board each of them was a single torpedo with a nuclear warhead. The yield of such a torpedo was comparable to the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. By the time the blockade began, they had not yet reached Cuba, which means the submarines ended up in a tight ring of U.S. anti-submarine defense, which started a continuous hunt for them, forcing them to surface. It is important to note that the submarines were not nuclear, but diesel-electric, which means they had to periodically surface to recharge their batteries. They simply couldn't hide from the American fleet deep underwater forever. But that is not all. These submarines were not adapted to operate in the warm waters of the tropics. They did not have a proper air conditioning system, and there was also a severe shortage of fresh water. As a result, the crew found themselves in brutal conditions. The temperature reached 60 degrees Celsius. People were fainting from a lack of oxygen. The ration of fresh water was reduced to 1 glass a day. And under such conditions, the crew found themselves in a situation where the battery charge was running out, and they would soon be forced to surface. Up above, the situation is heated to the limit and could escalate into a nuclear conflict at any moment. Or maybe it already has, it's unknown, since there is no communication with Moscow. And so the submarine begins to be bombed, and the crew does not and cannot know that these are just practice depth charges that pose no danger to them. The assumption that a nuclear war has broken out and that U.S. ships are trying to destroy them would not be entirely unfounded. And all this time, there is a nuclear torpedo loaded in the torpedo tube. All this context is what made this situation so dangerous that the threat of launching a nuclear torpedo was not at all illusory. So, torpedo away. What happens next? A few minutes after the launch, an underwater nuclear explosion destroys the American aircraft carrier strike group. Most likely, the submarine will not be able to survive either. Within 15 minutes, the White House learns of the nuclear explosion and the destruction of the American ships. In the current situation, such an attack would be perceived as the start of a nuclear war by the Soviet Union. A response would follow immediately. American aviation destroys the Soviet missile positions in Cuba. A full-scale invasion begins. The U.S. did not suspect that there were not only intercontinental nuclear missiles in Cuba, but also tactical missiles with nuclear warheads, which would be used to strike U.S. forces. The U.S. base in Guantanamo would also be destroyed. Upon learning of the use of nuclear weapons against their landing forces in Cuba, the U.S. activates the SIOP-62 plan. This is an uncompromising nuclear strike. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons take to the air. From U.S. territory launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, and from the territory of Turkey, Italy, and Britain, nuclear strikes are launched using medium-range missiles. Even before the missiles reach their targets, the early warning systems in the Soviet Union warn of the launch. Nikita Khrushchev gives the order for a massive retaliatory strike. Soviet intercontinental missiles fly towards major American cities. Medium-range missiles destroy London, Paris, Berlin, and NATO military bases all over Europe. By the morning of Monday, October 29, 1962, the Northern Hemisphere in its familiar form no longer exists. Of course, this is just a theory, and merely an assumption of what could have happened. There is no exact scenario, nor can there be. But fortunately, the torpedo launch did not happen. The crew competently assessed the situation and, over time, understood by the explosive power of the bombs that non-combat shells were being dropped on them. Already the next day, a final compromise was found between the superpowers. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its nuclear weapons from Cuba. In return, the United States of America agreed to secretly withdraw its nuclear weapons from Turkey, and also lifted the naval blockade and gave official guarantees of non-aggression against Cuba.